This is the Kofford Books Authorcast. I'm your host, Brian Whitney. In this episode of the Authorcast, we are going to feature a recorded panel discussion that took place on February 2nd at Writ Vision, a fine art gallery and rare book dealer in Provo, Utah. The subject of the panel was the Mormon Image and Literature series, and the first release in that series, the Mormoness, or the Trials of Mary Maverick, edited by Michael Austin and Ardis E. Parshall. Now, this is a little longer than our typical episode, but I think that you'll find it engaging and well worth your time. So let's introduce our panel. Ardis E. Parshall is a historian, freelance researcher specializing in Mormon history, and author. In addition to the Mormon Image and Literature series, she has also co-edited with Paul Reeve, Mormonism, a Historical Encyclopedia, and is currently writing She Shall Be an Ensign, a history of the LDS Church told through the lives of Mormon women. She keeps a blog at keepapitchinin.org. Janelle M. Higbee is a writer and editor with a particular interest in 19th century Mormon women. She has worked for the LDS Church History Department and the Mormon Women Project. She has also taught at Brigham Young University and Utah Valley University. She's also a member of the Mormon Women's History Initiative team. Zina Peterson teaches courses in early British literature and language at Brigham Young University. She received her graduate degrees from the Catholic University of America, and her research interests include the literary history of Christianity, mysticism, women's religious and spiritual writings, Chaucer, Mallory, and King Arthur traditions. So sit back and get ready for a lively talk from Ardis about Mormon depictions in dime novels, which often featured scandalous tales of young girls being kidnapped and forced into polygamy, ghost stories, detective stories, and more. Although not high in literary quality, dime novels of the 19th century captured and captivated the American imagination and informed, or misinformed as the case may be, the general public on what the Mormons were. Janelle will then discuss the Mormoness more specifically, and Zina rounds out the discussion by contextualizing the dime novel genre into Victorian trends and comparing it to current depictions of Mormonism on television, in the news, and on Broadway.
Okay, we're up and running. I just want to thank everybody for coming, especially those of you that braved weather to get down here. In particular, I want to thank Ardis for being here, but also our panelists. I expect tonight is going to be an interesting but also very informal, casual, and enjoyable discussion. I know we want all of you to participate. I don't exactly know what we have in store. I know the artist wants to tell us about the series. This book that we're actually, going to be reading from is the first of a series that Greg Kofford Books is publishing. The artist and Michael Austin are co-editing, and it's the Mormon Image and Literature. And so we're going to learn more about the series. We're going to learn more about this particular book. I think we may even get a couple of excerpts from the book. And we're going to get some response. And we want this to be a discussion not just about the book and the particular story, but about the series, about the Mormon image in literature, about how public perceptions of Mormonism are shaped by popular literature or other kind of pop depictions. So in addition to whatever the panelists have prepared to say, we'll also have some audience Q&A. We'll just kind of turn this into a discussion. And I'll just let you guys handle that. So I'm just going to turn the time over to you and, hopefully probably an hour, I think, start to finish.
20 minutes or so.
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Including Q&A and stuff, yeah. Okay. So thank you again for being here and enjoy.
I'm going to stand. There is a 1855 novel, we were arguing about how to pronounce it, Bodisha. The heroine tells of sitting in her Salt Lake City home when a woman entered my room, apparently under the influence of great excitement and sobbing with grief. Save me, she cried. From what? Demanded I. From hell, she answered. I succeeded in extracting from her that she was named Mary Maxwell, was married, and about to become a mother. Keep that visual image in mind. That her husband had deserted her for another woman, and he had driven her from his house with blows. She seemed to fear being pursued. I asked her if anyone had followed her. She said yes, that Bernard Yale, the novel pseudonym for Brigham Young, was after her. Mary Maxwell seemed to imagine that I could defend her against Yale. I promised to do my best to protect her. But what, alas, is a woman's arm against the strength of a man? I sat quaking with fear. At this moment, the door opened. Yale, accompanied by two men whose faces were covered with masks, entered the room. Is one Mary Maxwell the devil's own child concealed in this house? Demanded Yale. If she is, you will do well to give her up. You are at liberty to search the premises, answered I, seeing that Yale did not suspect that Mary Maxwell was in the very room where I was. She'd crouched behind a chair, and the narrator had thrown a shawl over the chair. I shall do so, answered he. Accordingly, he with the two men searched the house. Now, you who know what the state of houses were in Salt Lake in 1855 know that it probably in this novel, all the houses are villas, multi-story. They have old servants' wings and all of that. But anyway, after a long absence and ineffectual search, Yale again entered the room where I was. I cannot find her, and he started to depart. As he passed the spot where Mary had crouched in the garden, a white handkerchief which she had dropped attracted his attention. He stopped, picked it up, and immediately began to search the garden. I saw that all was lost, but determined to defend Mary, I exclaimed, "Run, run, Mary, run!" She started. With a demonic shout, Yale started after her. After the lapse of a quarter of an hour, during which, as I heard no sound, I began to hope that by some miracle Mary Maxwell had escaped, she suddenly darted into the room and fell upon the floor, pale, ghastly, and covered with blood. Yale followed after. He entered the room and walked towards her. "Will you go with me?" he asked. "No," answered the dying woman. "Then you are done for," said Yale, and deliberately, before my very eyes, in spite of my wild screams for his mercy, he fired at her and scattered her brains over the floor. Boadicea was presented as the true story of a real-life woman who suffered under Mormonism in Utah, and who, after witnessing a startlingly large body count, this book is the Titus Andronicus of Mormon literature, she escaped to the safety of eastern Utah. And this pretended nonfiction status was shared by a number of early novels that featured Mormonism. In the same year, 1855, it was published Maria Ward, Female Life Among the Mormons. It's another tale of murder and abuse and escape. If you read these novels as biography, you might wonder how women came to Utah, why they came to Utah to suffer this way. But other novels will make that clear. Bessie Baines, a novel from 1876, introduces a young heroine living in the Midwest. She had been courted by a Mormon missionary, and she had spurned his offer to become his fifth wife. One day, as she and a friend are walking in the countryside, Bessie catches sight of a man following behind, who darts into the trees at the side of the road when he notes he's been spotted. Just then, a wagon comes along, and the two friends make room. One goes to one side of the road, and one goes to the other. Bessie ran behind a huge rock, looked back, saw that the horses were headed for it, and then, avoiding 2 or 3 small trees, turned to the left and was springing up a bank when a hand seized her arm and pulled her back. And a voice said, "If you make the least alarm, I will shoot you." She was whirled around until she stood face to face with the stranger who had dogged them. It was Elder Russell the Mormon. As she stood looking at him, too amazed to speak or act, the horses dashed past them with a terrible noise. The Mormon kept his hold on her arm with one hand, and in the other he held a revolver, the muzzle of which was not 6 inches from her face. "I am not to be trifled with." Oh, excuse me, I said that wrong. "I am not to be trifled with," he whispered, as the uproar of the runaways grew fainter. "If you open your lips to utter a cry, I will kill you and then shoot your companion." Her capture by the Mormon, whom she instantly recognized, paralyzed Bessie. Like Bessie Baines, Dolores, the Danite's daughter, was kidnapped by a Mormon and dragged to Utah against her will. You'd have to read the book to understand why the Danite's daughter is not already a Mormon in Utah, but it's because her mother ran away and committed suicide. I'm telling you, these books are not for the faint of heart. Mormon missionaries were still up to their nefarious schemes in the early 20th century when Jason Abbott, a young governess in the British town of Liverpool, was hypnotized into following a missionary. As Ziba spoke, Ziba is the missionary, it was not his words, so terrifying and bloodthirsty, that worked an effect on Jason's mind. She was gradually being hypnotized, completely entranced by the fixed gaze of those fiery eyes. I teach this in the MTC, I guess. The sensation dazed her brain, and she fancied the room filled gradually with strange mediumistic vapors. She was not alone with Ziba. There were angels and archangels thronging the apartment. He held both her hands firmly, yet she was barely conscious of the touch. She fancied her spirit was elevated, and leaving her body, floated high above the narrow window frame. Your people are not for God, he continued, and now his voice sounded as a judge condemning the unworthy. They will be hewn in pieces. In her right mind, Jason would have shuddered at the curse to fall on her parents. Now those parents no longer existed in her life's scheme. She was another being snatched away from them by mesmeric trickery. Little one, he whispered, come with me to a land of prosperity. Let my love unfold you, be my wife. You shall see the beautiful River Jordan flowing through the rich valley of the Salt Lake and Utah lakes, a veritable land of milk and honey. In Utah you will be rich. You will share the joy of spiritual wives. Through marrying me, you will be saved from the damnation awaiting you, if you obey my commands implicitly. Repeat these words slowly after me. Ziba's will be done. Now, novels like this were everywhere in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were sold as bound books in printers' shops, and they were peddled as dime novels, or in Britain as penny dreadfuls, and they were serialized in newspapers. Imagine you were a missionary knocking on doors in the American South, or about to take the stand at London's Hyde Park to conduct an outdoor meeting. Or imagine you were the mother of such an elder. You know exactly what the people behind the doors or in the crowd think of you and what you're about to say. And yet there you are, willing to meet people and spread your message. Or if you're mothers, you've willingly sent your son out there. Literature helps put you in the mindset of people of past eras. It adds another dimension to Mormon history, whether you're looking at it as a Mormon or as a non-Mormon. Literature helps you reassess writings from the past. If you read something from the Mormon past or something from last week that sounds a little too defensive, maybe there's reasons for that defensiveness that you haven't necessarily been aware of before. Some such things are not really in the past all that much. I remember one of my first jobs when I was 19. There was a woman working in the same office who was a member of a conservative Christian sect who knew all about what went on in the Mormon temples, and she was delighted to tell me that part of the ceremony was that the bishop got the first crack at all the brides. This is not that long ago. I'm straight out of the world that produced these novels that I've quoted from.
Wait, you mean he doesn't? I'm sorry.
No, I know things have changed, but not every novel in the Mormon Image and Literature series is about innocent women kidnapped by missionaries, rescued by the gallant Gentile cowboy, just as they're being forced into marriage. A good share of them will be, because that was an enormously popular trope. But some of them are detective novels set in a fantastic version of Utah. Did you know that there's a huge cavern that runs under the Great Salt Lake, and that there are tunnels from that cavern that connect the homes of all the major Mormon figures? And this is how the Mormon leaders moved their victims from one point to another. You can read about that in one of our volumes to appear in not too distant future. We have a ghost story. It's better written than some of these other Mormon novels, set in upstate New York. It's the kind of ghost story that I enjoy. It's not overly bloody, and it's not, I don't know, it's set in a real world setting, but there are strange noises and unexplained lights and people who disappear, and it is a sympathetic portrait of a Mormon apostle, not one you've ever heard of before, who is the key to solving the mystery behind the ghost. Christine Hagland is going to be our guest editor for that one. We also have humor, honest to goodness, really funny humor that doesn't depend on humiliation or sarcasm. That is going to be a book about Artemis Ward, and we're hoping that Joe Campbell, who's already done an awful lot of work on Artemis Ward and the Mormons, will be the guest editor for that volume. We have books written by Mormons. There's the dramatization of one of our scriptural stories that was first published as a novel, then played on the stages of the West, and then had 1 week's run on Broadway. I love the reviews. There's a novel written by a Mormon that served as a missionary tract where we tried to show people who we really were and what we really believed in a story form rather than a straightforward doctrinal essay. There's an epic poem written by an apostle. I've been working on transcribing that one today, and as I worked on it, I heard it in the voice of Alan Rickman. If you find it a little hard to follow, hear him in your mind, and the notes that are being prepared by Mike Austin will make all clear. Maybe. All of our novels are being prepared with historical introductions, with biographical information, with appendixes of documents that are related to the novel. They're intended to be read for pleasure. They're intended, we hope, to be used in academic classes. That's one reason why we're keeping the cost as low as possible, so that a class might be able to afford to use 2 or 3 or more at once. The first volume that's just been issued by Greg Kofford Books is The Mormoness, or The Trials of Mary Maverick. It was published 2 years before Boadicea, that first dreadful novel that I read from. And it's the first original novel with Mormon content. I think that both Janelle and Zina will be addressing that novel directly, so I'll only say that it is startlingly different from Boadicea and for most of the other novels that will appear in the series. Mary Maverick, the Mormoness, is not the Mormon you would design for your own Mormon novel. But if she were a member of your Ward Relief Society, with some minor polishing, she would fit right in. So let's hear what Janelle has to say about her.
Thank you. Well, the bad news is, as Ardis mentioned, the Trials of Mary Maverick is much more tame and a lot less blood-curdling and enthralling than some of the other books in the series. The good news is it presents a surprisingly complex, to a degree, and a sympathetic picture of Mormons and Mormonism at the time. Now, the book was published first in 1853, which was, of course, a few years before public knowledge of the practice of plural marriage came about. So that's probably one of the reasons why it is such a sympathetic book. And polygamy is not mentioned at all in the book. It's not one of the trials that the heroine has to deal with. So let's get that out of the way right up front. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 different things. The first is I'm going to introduce you to a woman named Philinda Merrick, who was the real-life counterpart of Mary Maverick. Philinda Merrick's life story is what the Professor John Russell based Mary Maverick's story on. And her story, as an early convert to Mormonism and as someone who experienced the trials in Missouri and life in Nauvoo and the trip across the plains to Utah, almost, spoiler alert, is one that's very not common, but not uncommon for women of the time. So I'm going to introduce you to Philinda Merrick and kind of compare a little bit how her life story compares to the story of Mary Maverick and where they differ in some significant points. Second, I'm going to touch briefly on the literary merits of the novel, or the lack of literary merit, which is just as significant. And thirdly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the characterization of Mary Maverick what she goes through and how she's presented influences or reveals both John Russell's character and the character of Mary Maverick and the character of Mormondom at the time. So let me start with introducing Philinda Clark Eldridge Merrick Keeler. She was born in Vermont in 1809, married at age 18 to Levi Newton Merrick. They were early converts to the church sometime in probably the mid to late 1830s. We don't know when exactly, but we know that they traveled with a group of saints who were trying to connect to the main body of saints, who ended up, unfortunately, at Haun's Mill in October of 1838. And Haun's Mill is the story which both inspired this novel and is the event on which the novel turns in the life of Mary Maverick. And it was a significant turning point in the life of Philinda Merrick. Her husband Levi was killed at Haun's Mill, as was their oldest son Charlie. Charlie was 9 years old at the time. He was one of the children who was hiding behind the bellows or some of the equipment at Haun's Mill. And he is the child who very famously or infamously, one of the mobsters pulled him out from his hiding place. When they begged him not to kill him, he said, "Nits breed lice," and shot Charlie in the head. This is not an event from which a mother or anyone recovers quickly, and it must have influenced Philinda's life significantly for the rest of her life. Charlie didn't die right away. He held on for about 3 weeks, and Philinda stayed in Haun's Mill and nursed him. There's one story that's told about how a doctor from one of the neighboring settlements, a Gentile, came and offered to help, and Philinda essentially told him, "We've had enough of your people's kind of help. I'm going to take care of my boy myself." Charlie died eventually. Philinda was left penniless with 3 small children to raise. There's a brief biography written of her by her granddaughter, which says that with the help of Brigham Young, she made it eventually to Nauvoo. I don't know what that help was, if it was financial or what. She, in Nauvoo, was invited to live in the mansion house in a room in the home of Joseph and Emma Smith, and she made her living there as a seamstress. That's another point that both departs from and coincides with the story of Mary Maverick. In a brief afterward in the book, in the appendix, Joseph Russell talks about how he came to hear the story of Haun's Mill and how he came to hear the story of Philinda Merrick. And he says that Philinda did not follow the saints to Nauvoo because she was not a very bigoted Mormon. She actually was pretty bigoted as a Mormon. At least she was devoted to the faith. She did end up on Nauvoo, and she did want to stay with the body of saints in Nauvoo. There's a pretty significant event that happens when she's staying in the home of Joseph and Emma, and this is from the biographical sketch that her granddaughter wrote. On a most significant day, Sister Emma came to her room. "Philinda, dear," she said, "lay aside your work a minute. I have a message from Joseph. He says the work of the women in the church is just as important as the work men have to do. He wants to organize us under the power and authority of the priesthood, that we may have the same heavenly guidance and direction in our lives the men now have. You have been chosen to be with us at the time. And now I must hurry on. There are preparations to be made." Emma, of course, was talking about the organization of the Relief Society in March of 1842. Philinda was one of the original founding members of the Relief Society who attended that first meeting, and was active in the Relief Society during the Nauvoo period. In fact, she was a topic of discussion at the very first Relief Society meeting, again by her champion, President Emma Smith, said that this is from directly from the minutes of the Nauvoo Relief Society. President E. Smith said that Mrs. Merrick is a widow, is industrious, performs her work well, therefore recommend her to the patronage of such as wish to hire needlework. Those who hire widows must be prompt to pay, and inasmuch as some have defrauded the laboring widow of her wages, we must be upright and deal justly. So that's kind of interesting, both as an insight into Emma's relationship with Philinda Merrick, and just the idea that you've got to take care of the widows, and if you're hiring penniless widows to do your sewing, treat them fairly. So Felinda in Nauvoo participated in plural marriage briefly, very briefly. She married Vincent Knight, who was a bishop in Nauvoo, in 1842. He died late in 1842, so she appears to have been his wife only for a few months. She was his second wife, I believe. His first wife, Martha McBride, was also a founding member of the Relief Society in Nauvoo, so they were very well acquainted. And there's a story, this is a side note, but there's a story that Martha McBride Knight was the first woman to be asked for permission to participate in plural marriage by her husband, the first one for her husband to say, "I'd like you to give permission for me to take a plural wife," and that plural wife was Felinda Merrick. She was widowed. Again, she was widowed after that brief marriage. She remarried again in 1846 to a man named William Keeler. Daniel Keeler, in 1846, and he spent some time as a stonemason and working on the Nauvoo Temple while she sewed curtains and altar cloths for the Nauvoo Temple. And he also worked in St. Louis trying to earn money for the family. When the time came to leave Nauvoo, the family couldn't afford to make the trip across the plains, so they moved to St. Louis, where there was a gathering of saints there. They stayed in St. Louis until 1852, and then they joined a company crossing the plains to get to Salt Lake City. Unfortunately, meanwhile, Felinda had contracted tuberculosis. She was ill for quite a while, but she still made the trip across the plains and made it as far as Wyoming Territory. She died near Fort Laramie in 1852. And that is the story of Felinda Merrick as we know it. As I mentioned, a couple of those points inspired the story of Mary Maverick. Significantly, the Hans Mill massacre and a couple of details that both match and don't match Felinda Merrick's name. But I think it's important to recognize that the story of Mary Maverick isn't just, doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's actually based on real events. Unlike a lot of things that Ardis was talking about, the kidnappings and the secret tunnels and whatnot, and that theme and that feeling really permeates the book. There are a couple of, I kind of mentioned the literary merit is less than the historical relevance for this novel, for the picture that it paints of both Mormonism of the time and literature of the time. It has some pretty significant problems with pacing. There's almost zero character development with a couple of exceptions. It's a fun read, it's a quick read, and it's an interesting story, especially understanding the context in which it was written and the reasons for which it was written, which Ardis and Mike's introduction goes into excellent detail about, and includes some details in the appendices. There's finally, I just want to talk briefly about the idea of what womanliness means, or what it meant to be the Mormoness for Mary Maverick. In one of the appendices, there's a biographical sketch of John Russell, the author, by his son. He describes his father a couple of times as womanly, or like a woman in his care of children and his care of other people. And that, again, is a theme. The care of other people runs consistently through the Mormoness. It's a good example of the Victorian trope of the angel in the house. Mary Maverick is essentially the angel in the house, although this book was published a few years before that phrase actually entered the lexicon. This idea that a woman is meant to be especially gentle, very pure, very single-minded, and devoted to her family, her husband especially. There are a couple of significant times which talks about how Mary follows duty, that the path of safety is duty. She, although her husband is converted to Mormonism in a fairly dramatic episode, she essentially is baptized in a pretty emotionless fashion out of duty to her husband. She says she will be like Ruth of old and follow him wherever he goes. This also harkens back again to the biographical sketch of John Russell, who describes his mother as Dorcas of old. So another biblical character who was known for her zeal and her piety and her devotion to good works. The characteristic of Mary Maverick, the Mormoness, throughout the book is her devotion to good works. She is bound both by duty and by affection. There's an interesting use of language in that when she's first introduced, she is referred to several times as his little wife, or the little woman to whom many things will happen. Time and again, she's kind of introduced that way. The pivotal moment after she is widowed and childless, she becomes the Mormoness, and her identity is the Mormoness for the rest of the book. She's not referred to again as the little woman. I expected more of a character development, as far as how being a Mormon changed her. It didn't so much. She stays the same throughout the book. That devoted, that pious woman of good works and of Christian charity throughout the book. There's another. Finally, one thing that comes up repeatedly is her devotion to her flower garden, both literal and symbolic. Her flower garden comes to symbolize her care of her love of beauty and her careful consideration of living things. And there are several instances where she comes back, where she plants a garden in circumstances that are less than ideal, where she comes back and finds her garden destroyed. This is, I think, one of the few instances of depth and symbolism that John Russell includes. And I think it's a good illustration of, again, Mary Maverick's devotion to, both her devotion to the ideal and her embodiment of the ideal of true womanhood and true Christianhood, which is essentially how she's presented in the book. And that's a brief sketch of both Philinda Merrick and Mary Maverick. Cool. And Zina's going to continue the discussion.
Greg Kofford Books is pleased to present The End of the World, Plan B, A Guide for the Future, by Charles Shiro Inoue. Environmental decline, political gridlock, war and rumors of war, decadence and immorality, The End of the World Plan B traces the idea of the end, or destruction of the world, through a number of spiritual traditions. It shows that our present understanding of the endgame has been distorted by a modern emphasis and demand on justice as the ultimate good. As an alternative to this self-destructive approach, Charles shows that in these traditions, justice is not the isolated end in itself that we ought to strive for. Rather, it is taught in tandem with its balancing companion, compassion. Plan B is a hopeful alternative to our fears about how things are going. The End of the World Plan B is available for pre-sale now at gregkoffordbooks.com.
My take on, I have actually more questions than comments. Did you write the introduction to this? Or was this Mike Austin?
It's mostly Mike.
Mike, because there's a quote that follows exactly on what you just finished up with, that says, by the end of Mary Maverick's story, two facts are indisputable. First, the heroine is entirely Mormon. They don't make a Mormon distinction in terms of like theology or anything. It's just that she has taken this on, and that's what she is going to do. And she is the Mormoness, woman whose identity is, she's not just a Mormoness. She's a woman whose identity is entirely contained in the statement of her religious affiliation. And since she sacrificed a child for it, obviously that means that, there's no other way. She's not going to pull out of that. And then the other thing that I wanted to quote from the book, which has got some great supplementary material, is this letter from John Russell to Thomas Gregg, where he is very defensive of these people. He says, you are starting to talk about them, and just talking trash about the Mormons, but he says, I do most sincerely regret the course you are pursuing toward the Mormons. I do not believe that it is your intention to excite a mob against these deluded fanatics. No, I do not. I know the kind heart that beats in your bosom too well to believe any such thing, he underlines it. But you could not pursue a more direct course to effect that object if such was your design. of this opinion, every reader of the Signal will bear me out. This is the publication they're putting out. The magazine that he's writing to talk about subscription rates and everything. It says, it's no difficult task to kindle up the fires of persecution against any sect, but especially theirs. The rabble in your country, as elsewhere, would gladly engage in the work were public opinion such as to screen them from punishment. And at the end he says, let me tell you an incident that will more fully explain my views. There is a family about 2 miles from this that are deservedly unpopular. Some months ago, a party of men were resolved to lynch the man. Though that family have spared no efforts to injure me and mine, were the deadliest enemies we ever had, and I believe are our only ones, I volunteered to defend that cabin or die. By immediate and vigorous exertions, I awakened such a spirit in this settlement that the mobocrats dared not make the attempt. I should act precisely on the same principle with the poor deluded Mormons. I think of Joe Smith just as you do, and I believe that a greater knave walks not on the face of the earth. Yet, were I there, I would defend his hearthstone with my blood. Joe Smith is an American citizen, and shame on the people, all that can tamely stand by and see the sacred rights of any American cloven down. My neighbor had deeply wronged me, but I could not see my own rights, yours, and those of every American trodden into dust in this person. So that, I think, is a better representation of it's a representation of his character, and that's the kind of integrity he wants to sort of insert into his fictitious characters, but he's not and I think he does that deliberately, choosing an unpopular group to not caricature, though. Yeah, caricature.
A little bit.
Simplify certain.
Yeah, simplify. That works. But what I wanted to talk about was how this very Victorian sense of honor and uprightness and being a good person, just very much at heart. And I will, I don't agree with what this guy says, and I felt injured by him, but I was willing to defend him to the death. Because that's what Americans do. That's what good people do. That's what, and he wants to show that good people can even be deluded into Mormonism. And so I was intrigued by the connections that this has with, and I looked at Terrell Given's book, The Viper on the Hearth. He talks about this book in there, and there's also, to go along with The Viper, there's the appendix from, what's it called, the Serpent Uncoiled, right? That's about various heresies that are, anti-Protestant or against the Protestant sort of mainstream beliefs, and it goes after Universalists, but Mormons are close enough that Universalism is a pretty scary thing for them. So I wanted to talk about the sort of setting up of the in-group and the out-group in something like The Serpent Uncoiled, where you have to say, well, look, these people are dangerous because they say that it's okay to believe heterodox ideas and still be saved. Because universalism is universal and says that everybody has a chance at heaven. It's way too dangerous, because what we need is the ability to control people with the threat of, the violence of hell or the blessings of heaven. And if we lose that, how could, that's the sort of subtext of it, but it's all it's all in defense of proper Protestant doctrine, and it sets up the boundaries and the barricades that say this is the in-group and this is the out-group, and if you are not in the in-group, then you are extremely dangerous, and if you're in the out-group that says there is no such thing as an in-group, then you're really bad, right? You're really bad. And so one of the ways they explored this was to go into these extreme exoticisms, and Victorians were obsessed with these kinds of things, like their Orientalism or their spiritualism or their medievalism. And as a medievalist myself, I was fascinated that the way that I've always heard it mispronounced, it's still being mispronounced, is Boadicea. Or there's Boadicea, there's Boadicea. They've since decided that it's Boudica, that was the actual name of the woman that they're trying to name. But I didn't know, so I'm completely unfamiliar with that book. But I know the story of the original Boudica, who was the Celtic Iceni tribe not priestess, but chieftain, who almost succeeded in driving out the Romans in 63 AD out of Great Britain. She raised an amazingly huge army and really gave Prastatages a run for his money. Had Colchester burnt all the way to the ground, and even now when they do archaeological stuff in Colchester or in London, they know it's the Boudican layer, the ash, because it was so hot and it burned so much of those cities. So she was extremely warlike. So I don't know how.
I don't know if that was intended. A lot of the characters
or if
in
it's
that
just a
novel
name.
have names from that.
Yeah, I would be really interested to look at those in terms of the medievalism that was going on, because this is also the age of Walter Scott, which is going to lead to sort of my next little discussion, which is that there's a lot of popularizing of fringy groups, right? There's fraudulent claims being made about actual history, like the famous one is it's from the 17th century, but it's the Book of Ossian. If you're familiar with this is James, now of course I'm blanking on the name, Macpherson, who claims to have discovered a Celtic book like unto one of the great epics of Homer. And it's Scottish and Irish in origin. And it has these beautiful stories, and it's got... it's extremely uplifting, and it's got nationalistic fervor for the Celtic, for the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh against their Anglo-Saxon overlords, and then their Norman overlords. And it was pretty much proven to be written by Macpherson rather than... he said it was a translation, and then a couple of people who actually spoke Gaelic said, no, it's really not. So, but it was enormously popular and influential because it was so inspirational, right? It's just exotic enough, and yet it still spoke to that sense of true pride and nationalistic fervor and all of that. And then you had in the next century, you have the Waverley novels, which is they were sort of the first big epic, historically placed fictions. And Walter Scott was really good at what he did. He also wrote Ivanhoe, and he also wrote a lot about the sort of pathos of the oppressed people, even while they're being exotic. So these ancient Celtic people are not like the Scots that you know now, because they haven't been oppressed for 300 years. So they don't, obviously they're going to be, better at this. And these people that you're trying to present as somehow wicked are just enough on the inside group to be human and to be respected, because they're enough on the outside group to be interesting, right? So there's the idea of exoticism is to say, well, that's a nice, we're going to describe the African slaves working in the plantations of Alabama as sympathetic enough that you feel sorry for them when they undergo something really horrifying, but still other enough that you're not really moved to do something about the structural injustice of slavery itself, right? You're not going to undermine the whole system. You're just going to go, oh, wow, isn't that so sad? I'm a good person because I feel so sad for these people. And so it's a sort of, it's a self-indulgent kind of self-flattering way of presenting things. And that's what I think is going on with this. I think he really does have a code of ethics that he sees rooted in a long history and in a long provenance and genealogy of good people, and he's one of them good people. And one of the markers of those good people is that they look at all the people without the marker of the good people, and they're still sympathetic, right? They're still going to be kind to them. And it's that kind of other, but not quite, because we're sympathetic, but similar but not quite, because they're still icky and outside. And it makes me reflect on things like the way we responded to, rightly or not, John Krakauer's book, Under the Banner of Heaven. How is it when we see ourselves presented, or a fringe group of what claims to be us, like the Oregon people, and we all went, oh, no, be named Ammon for real, don't, right? We all were really hoping, oh, it's the Bundys, okay. And there is, within our history, and we know it, the reasons for that. You can read passages of the Book of Mormon that say, go out and do this, right? Defend this because of that. And you can, if you're a Bundy, read it as in, go take over a bird watching station. But you also can, again, there are people that are sort of seeing the pathos in the one that was shot. The one guy that sort of, they really, really wanted to die in violent flames because we knew they were Mormon and they didn't bring snacks. How could that be? Right? They must have wanted to die.
They didn't have the Relief Society with them.
Well, that. Yeah, and they did. There were some problems too, because one of the snacks that they requested was coffee, and so we just, they probably weren't that good a Mormons. Anyway, so I think it's a reflection that's still going on. Maybe we have more extremes of it. Again, seeing ourselves portrayed, we see an interesting portrayal here because so many of the 19th century ones were all about the horde, the harems of women, and the Blackbeard theme or the Bluebeard theme of multiple women, all of whom are like disposable for these horrible men, and they did combine the exoticism of Orientalism with the Bluebeard thing with Mormons because of the tie with polygamy, because Mohammedans can also have multiple wives, and then you have the things like the I don't know which one it is where the heroine jumps off the top of the Salt Lake Temple into the Salt Lake, into the Great Salt Lake.
Never actually discovered that. Is
that just a rumor? Or
that keeps being quoted, but we've
I
never
think
discovered one.
It might be the tunnels. Then they might be getting that mixed up with the tunnels.
Maybe.
So the Great Salt Lake needs to be accessible, though, to the temple. Obviously.
Tunnels may go a lot farther than we realize.
Right. And there are ways in which the sympathetic depiction is over the top and smarmy, and just like the angel in the house idea that you had. Kind of like the ways that Elder Price is presented as just too darn good in the Book of Mormon musical, where you have this outrageously offensive, desperately pushing every envelope in terms of vulgarity, trying to be as offensive as possible, and yet keeping those main characters of Mormon innocence so very likable, right? There's a kind of condescension in that's, and to couple it with the fact that the Book of Mormon musical is set in Africa, and the depictions of Africans are very blackface, very, Africa, it must be all primitive, just like Mormons, they must be all fill in the blank. And it's trying to satirize that as well, but how successful it is really depends on a lot more elements than just how offensive can we be and how funny can we be while maintaining the audience's prejudices that keep them feeling like they're good people. Because, we're walking into this musical, and by golly, those Mormons believe insane things, but the fact that I like Elder Price when I'm done with that musical means that I'm a good person. What more do you want from a musical? It's a feel-good musical, right? Because it makes you feel good about extending your mercy to these besotted people, just like the Mormons are to the Africans, just like the audience is to the Mormons. It's just the little layers of how exotic are we going to be. And we come in right between weird and dangerous and harmless and goofy, right? And we've seen that sort of played out kind of in a really kind of sad or funny or both caricature I think in the Oregon bird watching takeover. And I think that if we look at this and see that as the roots of what's happening now, it makes a really interesting sort of full circle that, yeah, we've always been portrayed as other, but we've also always been portrayed gently, as long as it can make the people who are portraying us feel good about themselves.
Thank you for joining us on this special panel discussion of the Mormon Image and Literature series. We'd like to thank our panelists, Ardis, Janelle, and Zina for their contributions, and also thanks to Writ Vision for hosting this event. You can subscribe to the Kofford Books Authorcast on iTunes and Google Play, and be sure to like us on Facebook to receive the latest information about our authors, releases, and promotions.